After her husband passed, Evelyn thought the quiet streets of Maple Ridge would finally bring her peace. She planted a small rose garden, a simple tribute to the man she loved. But to the HOA, it wasn't a memorial, it was a violation. They called it unauthorized landscaping and ordered her to tear it down. When she refused, they decided to make an example of her, one fine, one threat, one humiliation at a time. But what they didn't know was that Evelyn had already lost everything that mattered. And this time, she had nothing left to lose. Maple Ridge was the kind of neighborhood people dreamed of retiring in: manicured lawns, quiet streets, and the soft hum of sprinklers at dawn. From the outside, it looked like perfection. But perfection often hides right beneath the paint. Evelyn Harper moved there 15 years ago with her husband, Tom. They were newly retired then, a pair of high school sweethearts who'd spent decades working, saving, and planning for a calm, simple life. Tom loved to tinker in the garage, fixing old radios and clocks. Evelyn loved her garden, wildflowers, herbs, and her beloved roses. Together, they built a peaceful rhythm. Coffee on the porch, small talk with neighbors, gentle laughter under the setting sun. But when Tom passed unexpectedly one autumn morning, the world fell silent. The house they had built together felt too big, too empty. The porch swing creaked differently without his weight. Even the ticking of the clocks he'd repaired began to sound lonely. To fill that silence, Evelyn planted a new rose garden, a circular patch right beneath their bedroom window. It was small, tender, and imperfect, just like life itself. Each bloom felt like a memory reborn. She named the white roses after Tom's favorite fishing spots, the red ones after the places they'd traveled. It became her way of keeping him close. For a while, no one said anything. Neighbors would pass by, nod politely, and sometimes offer condolences. But beneath those sympathetic smiles, Evelyn could feel the shift, the way people whispered a little longer after she waved, or how their eyes flicked toward her yard like it was something off limits. Then came the first letter, neatly folded, slipped beneath her door in an unmarked envelope. Notice of violation, unauthorized landscaping installation. Please remove the non-compliant structure within 14 days to avoid penalties. Evelyn read it twice, her hands trembling. She thought it had to be a mistake. The roses weren't hurting anyone. They weren't blocking a sidewalk or spilling onto a neighbor's lawn. They were just flowers. She called the HOA office to clarify, and that's when she heard the voice that would soon become her shadow, Deborah Miles, the HOA president. Deborah had a tone that could slice through glass, polite on the surface, but dripping with condescension. "Mrs. Harper," she said, "we all appreciate your creativity, but Maple Ridge has very specific landscaping standards. Memorial installations, unfortunately, fall outside of our aesthetic guidelines." Evelyn tried to explain that it wasn't an installation, that it was a personal garden, that it helped her heal. But Deborah cut her off. "I'm sure you understand," she said sweetly. "We all have to follow the rules." And just like that, the call ended. Evelyn hung up the phone and stared out at her roses. The morning sun was glinting off their petals, soft and defiant. She could almost hear Tom's voice saying, "Don't let them push you around, Evie." So she didn't. She ignored the letter. She kept tending her garden, pruning and watering as if nothing had changed. A week later, a fine arrived. Then another. Then, one morning, she stepped outside to find a bright orange sign staked into her lawn. HOA violation, property non-compliant. The sign stood there like a scarlet letter for all the neighborhood to see. That's when Evelyn realized this wasn't about flowers. It was about control. From that moment, the air in Maple Ridge changed. Neighbors who once waved began to avoid eye contact. Deborah's patrols grew more frequent. Little notes appeared in Evelyn's mailbox. "We all have to do our part. Rules keep our community beautiful. Maybe you should consider a simpler hobby." The unspoken message was clear: you don't belong here anymore. But Evelyn had survived loss. She wasn't going to be run off by people obsessed with paint swatches and hedge heights. So she kept planting. Every fine, every thread, every glare, she answered it with another rose. And soon, what began as a quiet act of mourning became something much bigger, a symbol of quiet rebellion against an HOA that thought it could dictate grief. The neighborhood didn't know it yet, but Evelyn Harper was about to change Maple Ridge forever. The sign stayed in her yard for 3 weeks. Neighbors passed by every morning, pretending not to see it. Some offered her pitying glances. Others crossed the street to avoid being associated. And every day, Evelyn watered her roses right beside that bright orange warning, as if to tell the world, "You can shame me, but you can't silence me." Then came the letters. Thick, official envelopes, stamped with the Maple Ridge HOA logo, each one colder than the last. Fine due, $250 for continued violation. Fine due, $500. Notice of hearing, board review scheduled. At first, Evelyn tried to reason with them. She sent photos of her garden, wrote letters explaining that it was not a monument, but a private expression of grief. She even attached Tom's obituary, hoping anyone, would understand. But no one did. Or maybe they simply didn't want to. When she arrived at the HOA hearing, the room was filled with polished smiles and folded arms. Deborah sat at the head of the table, flanked by two board members who barely looked up from their papers. Evelyn stood, clutching her folder. "I'm here about my garden," she began, her voice soft but steady. Deborah gave a patient smile. "Mrs. Harper, we've reviewed your case. The bylaws clearly prohibit any form of memorial or decorative structure not approved by the board." "It's not a structure," Evelyn said. "It's just roses. Flowers. That's all." One of the board members, a man with sharp glasses, leaned forward. "You were notified multiple times. Noncompliance results in escalation." Evelyn's throat tightened. "This garden helps me cope. It's not harming anyone." Deborah's tone hardened slightly. "Rules are rules. If we allow exceptions, we lose order. And without order, we lose our community." Evelyn met her gaze, quiet fire in her eyes. "You've already lost it." The silence that followed was heavy. Then Deborah leaned back, smiling thinly. "You have 14 days to comply before we initiate a lien against your property." Evelyn didn't answer. She turned, lifted her chin, and walked out. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the letters, each one more menacing than the last. She felt anger rise in her chest like a slow flame. She'd lost her husband. She'd lost her peace. She wasn't going to lose her home, too. So she began to fight back, quietly, methodically. Evelyn started documenting everything. The letters, the phone calls, the fines. She kept a notebook detailing every date, every encounter, every time Deborah stopped in front of her house pretending to inspect something. And then she noticed something odd. On the HOA's own website, there was a line in their bylaws that Deborah had conveniently overlooked. Exemptions may be granted for personal gardens not exceeding designated perimeter limits. Evelyn measured her garden. It was well within the limit. She had proof. The next morning, she sent a certified letter to the HOA, citing their own rules and demanding the fines be voided. She copied the county housing department for good measure. She didn't hear back for a week. Then, one evening, a white SUV pulled up in front of her house. Deborah stepped out, clipboard in hand. Evelyn watched from her porch as the woman walked slowly along the garden's edge, taking pictures, scribbling notes. Finally, Deborah looked up and said, "You can't intimidate the board with paperwork, Mrs. Harper." Evelyn set down her watering can. "I'm not trying to intimidate anyone," she said calmly. "I'm just asking for fairness." Deborah's eyes narrowed. "Fairness isn't the issue. Compliance is." And with that, she turned and left. The following week, Evelyn noticed something else strange. Her mailbox flag was bent. Her trash can had been moved halfway down the block. A small tear appeared in one of her rose bushes, as if someone had yanked at it. At first, she thought it was coincidence, kids, wind, anything. But when she found tire tracks leading onto her grass one morning, she knew better. This was personal now, and she wasn't the only one being targeted. Her neighbor, Carl, a retired teacher, stopped by one day with a worried look. "Got a violation for my shutters," he said. "Same color they've been for 20 years. Deborah says they're fading inconsistently." Another neighbor mentioned being fined for leaving a recycling bin out for more than 18 minutes past collection time. Evelyn realized what was happening. Deborah was tightening her grip. Anyone who sympathized with Evelyn was being punished. But instead of isolating her, it did the opposite. Slowly, people began to whisper. A small group gathered in Evelyn's backyard one evening. Carl, the Johnsons from the corner, and a few others. They sat in lawn chairs surrounded by the very roses that had caused the chaos. "She's abusing power," Carl said. "Someone needs to stop her." Evelyn nodded quietly. We will, but we'll do it right. The next day, Evelyn filed a formal complaint with the state's Department of Housing. She attached copies of every fine, every email, every inconsistency in the HOA's bylaws. Then she went further. She contacted a local journalist who'd written about HOA corruption before. The woman listened carefully, asked questions, and requested permission to visit Maple Ridge. Within a week, a small news van appeared on the corner. Cameras rolled as the reporter interviewed Evelyn by her garden. "I'm not against rules," Evelyn said on camera, her voice calm but firm. "But rules should protect people, not punish them. I just want to be left in peace." The story aired that evening under the headline, "Retired Widow Faces HOA Backlash for Planting Roses in Memory of Late Husband." It spread quickly. Neighbors who had once ignored her began stopping by to offer support. A few even posted online, sharing their own stories of being bullied by the HOA. And that's when Deborah snapped. At the next HOA meeting, Deborah called for a special session, mandatory attendance for all residents. Evelyn went, knowing it would be ugly. The community hall was packed. Deborah stood at the front, her voice sharp and cold. "This community has been subjected to unwanted media attention," she said, "because one homeowner refuses to follow our guidelines. Her actions threaten the harmony we've all worked so hard to maintain." Murmurs filled the room. Some nodded. Others looked uneasy. Evelyn stood up. "Harmony," she said quietly. "Is that what you call this? Fines, threats, humiliation." Deborah's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Harper, please sit down." But Evelyn didn't. She faced the crowd instead. "All I did was plant roses. You all know me. You know Tom. You know why I did it. And you know this isn't about flowers. It's about control." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Carl stood up beside her. "She's right," he said. "We're all tired of being afraid of our own board." One by one, more people stood. The room began to shift, a quiet rebellion unfolding in real time. Deborah's voice rose over the noise. "This is insubordination," she snapped. "You people forget. This HOA owns this community." Evelyn turned back to her, her voice steady. "No, Deborah. We do." That sentence hung in the air like a spark before a fire. After that night, everything changed. The fines stopped coming, but the tension grew heavier. Deborah stopped waving during her daily patrols. She began walking with another board member, whispering furiously. Evelyn kept tending her roses, but she knew something was coming. One last strike before the storm broke. And she was right. 2 weeks later, she received a certified letter. "Final notice, noncompliance. The HOA board has voted to place a lien on your property." That was the moment Evelyn decided she wouldn't just defend herself. She would expose everything. She called the journalist again. This time, she gave her access to everything. The correspondence, the bylaws, the discrepancies in the HOA's financial statements she'd started noticing in her research. Late one night, sitting at her kitchen table, Evelyn found what she'd been looking for, a pattern of maintenance fees that didn't match actual expenses. The HOA was quietly siphoning money, and at the center of it all was Deborah Miles. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. They wanted to bury her garden, but they'd just handed her the shovel to dig up something much deeper. The next meeting would change everything. The night of the HOA's emergency meeting arrived with a restless sky. Dark clouds rolled over Maple Ridge as if the weather itself sensed what was coming. Evelyn arrived early, carrying her worn leather folder, the one filled with every letter, every fine, every piece of proof she'd collected. The community hall lights flickered above her as she took a seat near the front. One by one, neighbors filtered in. Some looked anxious, others curious. Whispers filled the air. For once, Deborah wasn't smiling. She stood at the podium, face pale, hair immaculate, a stack of papers before her. When the clock struck 7, she spoke. "This meeting," she began, "concerns ongoing noncompliance and disruption caused by Mrs. Harper." But before she could continue, the door at the back opened, and in walked the journalist, camera crew in tow. A hush swept through the room. Evelyn didn't move. She just watched as Deborah froze mid-sentence. The reporter nodded politely. "We're here by public invitation," she said. "Given that HOA meetings are open to residents, and that this one concerns a matter of community transparency, we're recording for documentation." Deborah's face tightened. "This is highly irregular." But before she could finish, a man in a gray suit stepped forward from the crowd. "Actually," he said, flashing a badge. I'm with the State Housing Enforcement Division. We received multiple complaints and some interesting financial documents. The room erupted in murmurs. Evelyn stayed quiet, her gaze steady. The agent continued, turning to Deborah. Ms. Miles, we have evidence of misappropriation of HOA funds. Over $40,000 in unaccounted maintenance fees. You're required to cooperate with the investigation. Deborah's voice faltered. This is absurd. We've done nothing wrong. But Evelyn stood, her voice cutting through the noise. You've done plenty wrong. You've bullied, humiliated, and stolen from the very people you were supposed to protect. The agent nodded toward Evelyn. And thanks to Mrs. Harper's meticulous records, we were able to trace every transaction. The camera captured everything, Deborah's trembling hands, the whispers spreading like wildfire through the crowd, the shock etched into every face. Then came the moment no one expected. Deborah's composure cracked. You think this place runs itself? She hissed. You think I wanted to be the villain? Someone has to keep order. Otherwise, people like her turn this neighborhood into chaos. Her voice broke on the last word. Evelyn stepped closer, calm and unflinching. Order without compassion isn't peace, Deborah. It's control. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. When the officers escorted Deborah out, her eyes lingered on Evelyn's. Not with hatred this time, but with something else. Regret, maybe. Or the realization that her reign was truly over. The story hit the local news that same night. HOA president charged with fraud after widow's complaint leads to state investigation. By morning, Maple Ridge was unrecognizable. The orange violation sign was gone from Evelyn's yard. So were the fines. So were the whispers. For the first time in years, the neighborhood exhaled. In the days following the confrontation, Maple Ridge felt different, quieter, but alive. The perfection that once defined it had been replaced by something warmer, sincerity. For nearly a decade, Deborah Miles had ruled the streets like a monarch, every mailbox and lawn under her thumb. Now, her empire had crumbled. Evelyn didn't gloat. She simply went back to what she loved, tending her roses. She noticed the way people looked at her now, not with pity or judgment, but with quiet admiration. The woman they'd once ignored had become the heartbeat of their community. And then, one morning, a letter arrived from the State Housing Department. Your persistence and evidence were instrumental in uncovering financial misconduct. The HOA board has been dissolved pending a full audit. Evelyn folded the letter carefully and tucked it beside Tom's old gardening gloves. She smiled, not out of pride, but peace. The neighborhood began rebuilding. A temporary committee formed to rewrite the bylaws. Fairer, simpler, kinder. Evelyn was invited to join, but she declined. She didn't want power. She'd already learned what it did to people. Still, the neighbors came often. Carl dropped by with a pie. You made this place livable again, he said. An elderly couple brought a thank you card. Because of you, we're not afraid anymore. Even the mailman lingered, smiling. First time in years I've seen folks wave at each other again. Evelyn would smile, nod, and look toward her roses. Tom would have liked this, she thought. But Maple Ridge didn't forget its scars. Some neighbors couldn't forgive easily, not Deborah, not themselves. For a while, the block parties were quieter, the smiles smaller. But real healing always starts that way. Fragile, awkward, and human. And through it all, Evelyn's roses became something more. Children called it Mrs. Harper's garden. People left small gifts, notes, pictures, even blooms of their own. It wasn't official, but it became a memorial for everyone who'd lost something under the HOA's rule. Then, one morning, Evelyn heard footsteps crunching along her gravel path. When she looked up, she saw a familiar face, Deborah Miles. Her hair was shorter, her shoulders lower, her eyes tired. She wasn't wearing her signature pastels, just a simple gray cardigan. For the first time, she looked human. I didn't expect to see you again, Evelyn said quietly. Deborah hesitated. I had to come. They stood there in silence, the air heavy but calm. I took a plea deal, Deborah said finally. Probation. Community service. I'll probably lose the house. Evelyn nodded. I'm sorry for that. Deborah looked up sharply. You're sorry. You did terrible things, Evelyn said. But I think you forgot what this place was supposed to be. Maybe now you'll remember. Deborah swallowed hard, then reached into her bag and pulled out something small, a rose cutting, carefully wrapped in paper. I took this months ago, she said softly. Thought I'd replant it after your garden was gone. It bloomed. Evelyn took it gently, smiling faintly. Then maybe there's hope for you yet. Deborah nodded and left without another word. Evelyn watched her go, and, for the first time, felt no anger. Only closure. Months passed. Maple Ridge changed. Lawns still looked neat, but now each one carried its own touch. A splash of color, a homemade bench, a sign of individuality. The new HOA, smaller, transparent, fair, voted to recognize Evelyn's garden as an official community landmark. They even placed a small plaque at its edge. The Harper Memorial Garden, a place for peace and renewal. When the sign was unveiled, neighbors gathered in celebration. Children played in the sprinklers. Laughter replaced tension. Evelyn stood quietly by her porch, hand over her heart, feeling Tom's presence in the evening air. That night, she sat by the window, the garden glowing under the streetlight. She opened her old journal and wrote, "Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's what you build after it, when you choose compassion instead of bitterness. Maybe that's what love truly is, the courage to plant something beautiful in hostile soil." She smiled, closed the book, and looked out at her roses swaying in the breeze. For the first time since Tom's passing, she felt whole again. Weeks later, another letter arrived, this one from the city council. They wanted to honor her for courage, integrity, and service. Evelyn almost declined, but then she remembered what Tom always said. Standing up for yourself helps others stand, too. So she went. As she stood on stage, looking at her neighbors, now friends, she said softly, "Rules matter, but people matter more. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is refuse to stay silent when silence is expected." Applause filled the room, not for rebellion, but for reminder. That community wasn't about control anymore. It was about connection. When she returned home that evening, the moonlight danced across the petals of her roses. She touched one bloom, whispering, "We did it, love." A single firefly drifted past and landed gently on her hand. Evelyn smiled. They tried to bury her garden, but all they did was plant her strength.